The banning of minority religious clothing, the closure of places of worship, demands that religious leaders of a minority community sign a charter of state values, calls for state-sanctioned and edited religious texts, creating state-run forums on reshaping an entire religion and its practice, their promotion and propagation of racist imagery attacking said communities, and around 70% of inmates thought to be represented by a minority religious demographic. Our immediate reaction may be, are we talking about China's forced sinicization of Uyghurs in the name of de-radicalization? Our immediate reaction would not be, oh, we're talking about France. France in the American imagination is linked to revolution, the intellectual basis of nation building. It is the cradle of modern Euro-American civilization, art, architecture, food, film, fashion, drink. It is an embodiment of the best of Western culture.
This time, we're exploring the wonders of Paris. Magnificent and, thanks to Monsieur Eiffel, riveting.
Do you hear the people sing? My place is here. I fight with you.
I mean, this is unbelievable. There's no city like this in the world.
You escape while I escape. You beat grass, get fucked up. Football so hard, best you fade. And I'm gonna reach for like 6 days. Cold body, slow body, spinning H on my 6 shade.
Whereas pop culture romanticizes France, U.S. news media coverage often privileges the French state's narrative on issues the country faces, focusing on integration, the division between immigrants and the real French, and the challenge of so-called Muslim radicalization.
But in France, this problem of Islamist radicalization in the country is very present.
In President Macron's defense of France's secular values, their freedom of speech, he has made France a target for radical Islam and for terrorists.
Paris and its landmarks are eerily quiet because of the coronavirus lockdown. But the tranquility is a mirage because a battle is taking place for the soul of France at its core principle of secularism, where religion should never interfere with citizens' rights.
I think it's important to note they don't have to go back to Syria to be radicalized. Much of this radicalization is happening, especially among criminals in the prisons here in Paris.
But what if we saw France for what it is? Not a country torn apart by a secular versus religious war, but a country that has failed to create a nation for all of its citizens. How different would our news coverage of France and its Arab and Muslim populations especially look then? Would we be covering a civilizational clash or a country that practices a two-tier citizenship? Welcome to Backspace, where we tell you how the story is told in our headlines and then we think about how we can tell it a little differently. France occupies a complicated but comfortable and special place in the American imagination that goes back to the founding and foundation of this country.
To understand how and why we put France on a cultural pedestal, there are two things. First of all, of course, a lot of our own ideas about liberty, about democracy, go back to the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. So there's a way in which Americans think about France as the bastion of democracy and liberalism. And then a second is that every country brands themselves abroad. And France's way of doing that has been about excellent food, high fashion, freedom, the endless books on kind of, how French women eat and don't get fat. This is all part of a cultural industry and a really long and complicated history between France and the United States of America.
Throughout their long relationship, they've had some really great moments and some not so great moments.
In France, there's a latent anti-Americanism that often peaks and surges when America does something that France does not like the Iraq War. In America, there's a latent mistrust of the French, which peaks whenever France either doesn't do what we want them to do or does something we don't.
But what's remained very consistent is how we view and understand France culturally.
And as always, the usual French bread. You're going to see French bread on all these meals because the French always have bread at all of them.
Paris is a mood, a longing you didn't know you had until it was answered. Paris is like love or art or faith. It can't be explained, only felt.
What are the French famous for? Perfume that smells good, sense of smell, Food that tastes good, sense of taste. Art, architecture, visual sense. Okay, there's really no explanation for their crap pop music, but, 3 out of 4 is not bad.
And in this repetition of what France is, we determine who France is, what it believes, and thus, who is French.
When you are reading about France or learning French in the US, generally your textbooks are telling you things that they think you want to hear. So you will hear about its many kinds of cheeses and its many kinds of wines, and somebody will be wearing a kind of ridiculous beret that would never happen in reality.
And so France in the American imagination is more like Carrie's or Emily's Paris.
Ever since I moved to Paris, my life has just been chaotic and dramatic and complicated.
Oh, Emily, you're getting more French by the day.
And less like a country born out of 2 waves of violent colonial rule and expansionism spanning 7 continents and the waves of migration that ensued. So how does this tension between reality and the way we're defining being French to mean something very specific translate in U.S. news coverage? Well, news coverage will focus and expand on a very clear line the French state itself has made amongst its population between the French and the immigrants. Our coverage often relies on the French state's insistence through rhetoric and policy that the issue the country faces results overwhelmingly from a resistance to integration, from a failure of certain populations to uphold French values, especially of secularism.
Muslims are pretty well integrated into American society. Their average incomes are the same as most Americans.
A point that the president made when he went to the mosque.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very different picture in France or, pick your European country where
they're not incorporated or integrated into the society.
One of the things that I think a lot of people, a lot of French talk about here that needs to be improved, and that's the integration of the Islamic communities here.
France is still a country of bistros and fine Bordeaux, baguettes and bucolic churches. But immigrants now make up 12% of the population, and they brought with them new beliefs and customs.
The coverage also highlights who is the perpetual immigrant in France, where that word, immigrant, is less about migration status than it is about race, religion, and who was a former colonial subject.
The idea that France has had issues assimilating its quote-unquote immigrant population is an interesting one. In the United States, just like in France, when you talk about immigrants, one knows automatically what immigrants we're talking about. If I was to say France's immigrant problem, nobody will assume that I'm talking about Italian or Portuguese folks who have immigrated to France in the last 50, 60, 70 years. Automatically, the notion of immigrant is stigmatized and also racialized. We know what kind of bodies we expect to see. We expect to see Muslim immigrants largely from North Africa.
And that racialization of immigrants and the immigrantization of second, third, and fourth generation French citizens, specifically those of North African and Muslim backgrounds, is clearly reflected in U.S. news coverage, often taking on a facade of a civilizational divide. Take, for example, the coverage of the 2015 Charlie Hebdo attack.
Gunmen have attacked the Paris office of French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. French officials say 12 people have been killed and 10 others have been injured.
On January 7, 2015, 2 masked gunmen claiming to be part of al-Qaeda in Yemen entered the premises of the controversial satirical magazine and slaughtered several people, allegedly as revenge for the magazine's depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. Immediately, the media conversation in the United States became in large part about civilizational fault lines, regurgitating, without much caution or pushback, the French state's narrative.
Some of the strongest outrage this morning appears in newspapers around the world. They are saying things like, liberty assassinated and war on freedom. Another spoke of AK-47s versus pencils. Others use a simple message, I am Charlie, to defend free speech.
Former President Nicolas Sarkozy said, I am overwhelmed by these barbaric events. Civilization itself is at stake. Civilization and freedom of expression.
There's already talk about introducing a French version of the Patriot Act and reforming the prison system in this country to prevent Islamists from becoming further radicalized behind bars.
I dearly hope that these atrocious attacks against Charlie Hebdo will be a wake-up call for France, but not just for France, but for our European allies.
The attack on Charlie Hebdo, a magazine also renowned for its racist and crass depictions of Black and Arab people, became an attack on the bedrock of Western civilization, on free speech, and the slogan "Je suis Charlie" became a rallying hashtag and symbol of solidarity. These attacks also came in the context of not only the 2014 rise of ISIS in Syria, but also a series of violent attacks and incidents spanning 18 months, many of which directly referenced or were claimed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This violence is horrifying, but coverage of any violence that is committed by a French Muslim primarily seems to be understood as a spectacle of foreign allegiance and hatred of freedom versus born out of something specific to the country in which the violence takes place. Meaning, even in coverage of violence, whether small scale or large, we see the line drawn between who is French and who isn't.
I think that we need a better vocabulary for making sense of the very real and horrific violence that has occurred in France over the past 5 to 10 years. But I think that that vocabulary is not why did they come here and hate France. This is a French issue, which means it's also one that reflects on the policies of the French state, which of course is not to say that this is warranted or justified. These are heinous acts of violence, but it's to make sense of it in a social, economic, and political context that honestly has more to do with France and its own tensions and issues than the theology of Islam. It's really important to both denounce this violence and to also have the right questions when we try to understand why this violence has occurred.
That means questions like, what conditions have led some young French Muslims to choose violence against civilians as an ostensible means of rebellion against the French state? What are the realities that some ghettoized, forgotten, and state-targeted communities face? What has made some members of French society vulnerable and susceptible to committing acts of violence against other citizens while claiming revenge for their killed religious kin abroad or for the honor of their faith? Because there are two options here. Either that these individuals, Muslim, Arab, and French, are pathologically inclined toward violence and unable to become a part of any society they are a minority in, or that there are material conditions that create and exploit vulnerabilities within communities which are systematically targeted in varying ways. Which line of interrogation should journalists take? Because there is a long history of French antipathy towards Muslims, toward Islam, that underlies not only contemporary French identity by design, but also the treatment of French Muslims as second-class citizens.
So I think if we see French colonialism as something that's important to how the French state operates right now, and surely many things have changed in the French state's logic in how it manages and governs Muslim communities. But nevertheless, there was this notion that Frenchness and Islam were somehow in contradiction. And indeed, I think that that is one of the kind of longer trajectory influences on current French policy, even as it's changed in all of these important ways since the end of the 19th century to the present day.
Today, that's looked like the secular French state still taking a very active role in shaping and defining Islam and what it means to be a Muslim in France, but under the guise of so-called de-radicalization that positions Muslims and Islam as inherently threatening. But we don't see a media hysteria or alarm here over what increased state control over French Muslim communities can be and is leading to. Instead, there is often a somber questioning of what this means for France. The French state's failures are rarely, if ever, explicitly dissected as the starting point for understanding what's happening in France, especially over the last 2 decades. This includes everything from the rise and empowerment of the French right wing and its ideology to increased acts of violence cloaked in the language of religion and vengeance to France's increasingly restrictive policies impacting over 5 million residents deemed a threat. So how can we discuss and understand France, French identity, the role of secularism, and French Muslims in a way that doesn't lean into reductive platitudes about civilization which indulge the French state's narrative? Well, we can start by dismantling the romanticism around France and Frenchness. What if we looked at France not as a strong, even if sometimes frustrating, republic who is an ally, and instead as, in fact, the embodiment of what a country looks like when it refuses to acknowledge how centuries of violent colonial policies and restructuring of other societies create new identities, new populations? Even the culture that we associate with France is a culture that benefits the idea of a France that is homogenous, that never colonized anyone. Because here's the thing, France didn't simply colonize Algerians, who today make up the largest group of French Muslims. It lived among them, separately, unequally, but the French lived in Algeria because Algeria wasn't simply a colony. It was France. You don't emerge from a 132-year-long colonial experience the same as you were going into it, whether you're the colonized or the colonizer. And the same policies of immigration, labor, citizenship, and social welfare that were drawn up to facilitate Algerian migration to France, whether in the 1920s or after World War II, were drawn up by colonial administrators. They didn't magically forget the division between the French and the indigenous. A key defining feature of France's colonialism was assimilating colonized populations to French values, culture, beliefs deemed superior, and that included for its Muslim colonial subjects to drop their Islamic beliefs and Muslim identity in order to be embraced as French. The case of Algeria provides a stark example of how Islam was used to separate who was considered French.
When Algeria became part of France, became 3 French departments in 1848, while the land was fully French, the people were not. Algerian Muslims in particular were denied full French citizenship until 1958. So they were offered certain kinds of rights. They were legally French nationals, but they were not full French citizens. And so in many ways, these individuals and their families have for a very long time been part of the French nation, but they have struggled to have full rights as citizens in the Hexagon, in metropolitan France, as well as in Algeria when it was still under French rule.
And in order to become French citizens, they had to renounce many particularities that define their Muslim identity and Islamic faith.
If somebody wanted to have the full rights of French citizenship, they had to say, okay, well, here are the Islamic laws that have governed my personal status, and I have to renounce those laws in order to be considered for French citizenship.
And the bodies of women have played a long and central role in France's attempts to push a very specific way of being and remaining French, especially on its Muslim citizenry.
The trope of getting women to take off the veil has a really long history in French colonialism. So during the Algerian War of Independence, for example, there were staged unveilings where French military figures would get Algerian women to take off the veil. And this was supposed to be a symbol of how these women had adopted French notions of freedom and republicanism, and a way to show to observers that indeed Algerians wanted to remain French.
All of this is fundamental to understanding how colonial attitudes and ideological structures evolved over time with regard to being French and the French state's dominion over the Muslim populations it has governed. It's also why the term immigrant is racialized in the context of France, because it is used to refer specifically to former subjects of the French Empire, many of whom are Muslim. And so another way to dismantle the romanticism around France is to also look at the language we use and read in our coverage. Integration and immigrant are part of a coded language that functions as a facade over deeper issues, from the history of labor discrimination against Muslims to diminishing civil liberties.
What do we mean by integration? Do we mean integration into the workforce? Do we mean people speaking French and having linguistic competencies? Do we mean something more abstract, that these folks acknowledge and admire something called French values? What does it take for you to lose this category of the immigrant and to just be French?
Then there's being explicit with what the trend of French policies targeting Muslims over the last decade means for human rights. France consistently has used the excuse of de-radicalization to enact policies of violence and social segregation against its citizenry. When other countries like China are accused of similar policies of forced assimilation that seek to strip culture and religion from a group of people, what does our media call that? Why is France just a struggle between secular and religious and not another case of a state attempting to erase an entire population in pursuit of dominating it completely, including in the private realm? In the same vein, words like left and right don't exactly mean much as distinctions on many issues when it comes to Islam, migration, and the French political landscape, which has been aggressively moving to the right for over a decade.
In Western media, we often see or read that people like Marine Le Pen or Éric Zemmour are racist, that these are people on the far right, and that this is the problem. And certainly, I agree that Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour pose a real threat to civic liberties in France, but that shouldn't lead us to overlook the threat that people like Macron also pose. I think it's really important for Americans to see Macron not as a kind of liberal Democrat as we might see the Democratic Party, but to understand that Macron's policies have been denounced by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, and that this question of Islamophobia in France is also one of creeping authoritarianism and a crackdown on civil liberties.
Finally, there's how we discuss violence committed in France as always decontextualized from the history of violence that defines the French state's relationship with its Arab and Black populations. There's this tendency to look at France's domestic experience of violence, specifically instances committed by French Muslims, as both in a vacuum and as unprecedented. Dr. Davis mentioned earlier how we need better language to talk about this, ask better questions. And I provided some questions for us all to consider how looking at it in a vacuum perpetuates a pathologizing of Muslims. As for this type of violence in the streets of France being unprecedented, it's not. France has a history of violence against its own citizens from former colonies, in addition to its long history of violence in those colonies. An example of that violence was the Paris massacre of 1961. Tens of thousands of Algerians took to the streets to protest in solidarity with the Algerian resistance in the War of Independence against France. French police opened fire on protesters, even drowning several. In the end, around 14,000 were arrested and several hundred were believed to be killed. The French government did not acknowledge the massacre until more than 3 decades later, and to date still has not apologized for it. Knowing the context doesn't mean providing a history lesson in reporting, but rather a readjustment of the framework used, a framework that doesn't functionally promote a minority population as being a perpetual threat. France does have rich, robust art, music, fashion, cuisine, but so much of that isn't in our and France's own projection of the country, its culture, and its population. Instead, we ignore the breadth of it, who built it, who exists in it, and what blood was spilled and soil was burned to create it. France. It's a country. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. There was a lot that we really couldn't get into in this episode, but maybe there's an opportunity here. Do you want to see perhaps content from us that's kind of behind the scenes, maybe longer interviews with our interviewees? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I'm still reading the comments. I want to assure you I'm reading them, and some of them are kind of really nice. Thank you.